All right, hello everybody. I'm still John Atack, no matter how hard I try. And this is still my very good friend, Hoyt Richards. Hi, Hoyt.
Good to see you, John, as always.
As always, it's such a pleasure. Um,
Yeah,
so, um, we have a single word topic for once.
that's right. That's right.
And the word is
Uh,
accountability.
Accountability. Yeah, because I think that is such an important part of the healing process of coming to take ownership. I mean, it's one of the things Brene Brown talks about, owning your story, right?
Yep.
And how that helps you overcome shame. I just think there's a natural like my new favorite quote is it's a lot easier to um you know fool a person than to convince a person they've been fooled, right? And so I just think when you're coming to grips with the fact that you've been through this experience and that you've been manipulated, you've been misled, you've clearly been lied to, and you come to grips with terms like mind control and those sort of things and brainwashing. um, the the impulse is to kind of say, well, during that time I did certain things I'm not proud of, but because of this influence I don't have to take as much ownership of them.
Mm,
And I think that's a real trap,
mm.
because it's no different than kind of being a drunk driver and killing someone and then wanting the hall pass, saying, well, listen, I was drunk, I did. You don't own the responsibility for
Yeah,
what you
sue
did.
the whiskey company. It's not me.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so I think it's such an important part of it, and such a challenging part of it, that I thought it'd be a good topic for us to discuss. Because recently I've been working on a project that's been related to the group that I was involved in, and I've been reaching out to ex-members and realizing in the conversation I'm having with them, just to even be able to diagnose that things that we both encountered in the past, which, and from my point of view, are clearly abusive,
Mm.
and whether they were on the side of being the abuser or more likely, being one of the abused, like most of us were, there is a resistance to even calling it such because it's so uncomfortable.
Mm. We
Uh,
don't like to think of ourselves as victims.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a lot of usually one of the techniques that these cultic groups use is you don't want to be a victim and don't play the role of a victim and all of that. And so when it comes to
And
the
go in the corner over there with the pointy hat on while you're not
yeah,
being a victim.
exactly. So when it comes to this point of view of having to kind of reevaluate your experience with this new lens of recognizing that the moment you started to get involved with this group, some manipulation was taking place. And then now having to look at that whole experience with that new perspective of how, starting at year, in month and date X, I was starting to be influenced. And how do I now process things from that point of view? And how do I take accountability? Because I mean, I think of like some of the awful things I said to my parents, I said to friends, anyone who kind of challenged me along the 20-year journey that I had in my group. Um, and I can't just cast it off and say, oh, well, I was brainwashed at the time. That doesn't mean I'm accountable for what
Mm,
I said, because whether I was under the influence or not, I do know at that time my intent was to be hurtful.
mm,
That was, granted, I was being influenced into saying that that was the right thing to do at the time, but it wasn't like I was unaware that the words I was speaking was going to be received in such a way that, and that my intent was to put down or hurt, or as they would say, put them in their place, or whatever those sort of
mm.
things are. And I think I think it's a really challenging thing for people to come about and really take the responsibility for it. And yet there's such benefit to doing it, because I think um, it allows you to see yourself in a more accurate light, and also learn from the experience of what we're all capable of doing. and therefore become maybe a better educator of how to illuminate to others how you get yourself in that situation, how you can learn from it, and how you can benefit from it. But you have to go through that system of accountability, and I think it's one that's met with a lot of resistance.
Yeah, I think it's tremendously important. In you would find people who absolutely blame the group they were in for whatever they did that was abusive.
Right.
And then you'll find people who are crushed with the realization. I have a very dear friend who in this context should not be named, who was held to be one of the nicest people anybody had ever met. And you've met him, actually. There's a mystery. And yet he was told the Ron Hubbard had decreed that the world had only 6 months left to go, and he'd got to take over in one of the bigger organizations, and he'd got to harry people to get their statistics up. And I was very surprised because not long after leaving, I talked with somebody who had been there under this guy's direction. And when I said, "Oh, it's my friend," and he's like, "You know him? He's a dreadful person," And I can remember this friend crying as he thought back of what he'd done, particularly during that period, the way that he'd bullied people because he believed the world was coming to an end.
Right.
And I think there's something in the legal process that's very important here, which is, first of all, did somebody do it? Did they have the intention to do it? Actus reus and mens rea. The act and the intention. But I think there is beyond, and we need to admit we did these things. I did it. That's it.
Yeah, exactly.
But then beyond that, there's mitigation and mixing the two together. So that you're saying, well, I did it because I was drunk. That, why did you get drunk? Well, I got drunk because my wife left me. So on and so on and so on. We've got all of these knock-on effects of cause and effect. And we have the situationist attitude, which of course Philip Zimbardo cleaves to, the brilliant Philip Zimbardo, that we respond in accord to situations to the most part. And I don't accept that. I have a kind of, I suppose I go 80-20 on that one, and I'm not a believer in the 80-20 rule. I think it's a silly idea to impose such a thing as a kind of magical rule upon everything. But I think in this case, that probably 80% of what we do is situational. It's because of the group we find ourselves in, the circumstance we find, the necessity of doing something to try and change something. But at least 20% is not. And so, I have said a couple of weeks ago, I said that I was not going to talk about Charles Manson for a while on my channel. But you've just brought up the essential question of the Manson family, which is how accountable are the members? So Vincent Bugliosi, the prosecutor, argued that they were robots. That was the word he used. He said they were brainwashed. And then when it came to sentencing for the women members, having said that they were completely under Manson's control, he turned it around and said, but they should also be executed. And he was asking for the death penalty for all of them. And the death penalty was, in fact, they were sentenced to death, and then the death penalty was briefly lifted in California. So it turned into life imprisonment. But that thought that, that I think Patricia Krenwinkel is still in prison, Bobby Beausoleil, and we're talking 54 years later. We're saying this. So this question of accountability really is the big question that, and just to shortcut, it's that I bore the hell out of the person who complained about me talking about Manson. I hate to do that. I believe that Charles Manson was accountable, but was not, in 8 of the 9 cases, guilty of first-degree murder. He wasn't. He wasn't there. How could he have been guilty of the murder? He was guilty of 9 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. And given, that the 3 strikes law, I mean, he'd had about 7 strikes by then already. So Manson, I think, proved himself to be dangerous enough that he had to be restrained for the rest of his life. I think the same was true for Tex Watson. This is a spoiler on the book I'm writing, obviously. We won't have to read it now. We know what he thinks. But I think all of the others, and what's really struck me, I've now read 14 books about this. I'm reading the trial transcripts. I am, knee deep.
You're in deep. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. And finding that every case was different. Their backgrounds were different. The way Manson appealed to them was different. And their participation was different. So Susan Atkins and Tex Watson seem more guilty to me than the others.
Yeah.
But for them to, we're looking at how do you recover from the process. And I think it's incredibly important that you do recover from the process before trying to help other people.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's often the hatred and upset about the group that is motivating a person, and quite frankly the need to destroy something to feel better. And I'm not convinced that that's very healing generally.
Yeah, no, I that's such an interesting point you're bringing up, because I think, when you kind of, for lack of a better description, over demonize the culprits, and because again, you fall into this black and white thinking of like, oh, well, they were bad, and therefore everything they did was bad, and therefore I have to destroy what's bad. And that becomes, and that's again a very cultic mentality, not seeing the shades of gray. And the same thing I think applies to the accountability side of these things. It's very layered in the sense that I think the opportunity in becoming accountable for, like I know when I think of accountability in my own personal experience, it's easy to kind of, and I say easy only because I've been doing it for 2 decades, to the best of my ability. It's easy for me to say, oh, I said this and I'm not proud of that, and or I did this thing and I'm not proud of that. And I know for me, even the things that are on the other side of it, where I chose to remain silent when I knew something was going on that was out of line, or I didn't interfere in something that was happening because I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I think those things are even harder for me to live with, because I realize the power of remaining silent and how that can really, cause even more damage sometimes. I think that's why I've become such a blabbermouth about this over the last 2 decades, because it's like I swung from one pendulum to the other. I'm like, I'm not going to be silent anymore. And I think that's just kind of a core thing I feel these days. But as I've gotten more comfortable with being accountable and talking about not only what I did or didn't do, like I was saying, but also going in a layer deeper and saying, well, this is how I used to think at that time. Like almost dig in deeper to the experience and say, with the intent to try to educate and make it more kind of user friendly to understand what happened and why possibly I did what I did, and what were the dynamics at play. It's even more beneficial to not only talk about what you did or didn't do, but what was the line of thinking that got you to make that choice. And I think that's the bigger reveal of what it's like to be in this cultic situation, where you've started to mistrust your own way of thinking, and what that's like to have kind of gotten clueless about this idea that your critical thinking can be eroded. And if you can start to paint the picture in kind of technicolor of, this is how I used to think, and this is how I used to approach these situations, this is why I behaved as I behaved, I think it's something that resonates with a lot of people, because we all do things like that all the time. And we all also have a resistance to being accountable for what's really the way we're thinking when we make those choices. And I think that's where it really gets interesting.
Yeah. And that, we're all on the spectrum. We're all on many spectra, much more than one.
Yeah.
But the way that somebody who, we look at somebody who is narcissistic, don't like that word, as you know, but because it's not true, but somebody who they're so self-involved that they have no idea of how annoying they are, how displeasing they are to other people.
Right.
It just means nothing to them. They just grab people. No, by the that, and then at the other end you have so-called echoists, not a term that's as much in use, thankfully, who don't want to draw any attention to themselves. You know, they don't want you to say happy birthday to them and things like that, and disturb their precious existence. And we're all of us somewhere in those scales of the amount of attention we want from other people and how we go about getting that attention. But I think that frequently psychologists and psychotherapists sort of have a kind of cookie cutter approach, and it's possibly why, you know, I've met with many people who had real problems with a therapist after being involved in an authoritarian cult. And you've got somebody like, say, Rachel Bernstein over there in LA, or my friend Christian Churko over here, who really understand and can really be helpful to people. But very often, if a therapist doesn't have any understanding of what the group did and how the group functions, then they will try and impose their idea of how people work. And there's this aspect, so they'll be looking to the genetic component maybe, but for the most part, you know, if they're looking at psychopathy, the genetic thing comes in, or in schizophrenia. But for the most part, they'll be looking for the conditioning that made you behave in this way. Now, this idea has bothered me since I was a teenager. You've got nature and nurture. We're never actually able to rise above that in any way. We don't make any decisions. It's because we were born this way and conditioned this way. And I rebel against that idea. I think that as we, or if we mature, that what we're doing is developing the ability to go against our conditioning, to go against even our genetic nature, and to work things out, to come to moral decisions, to use the conscience, to use the critical thinking, and take responsibility.
Yeah.
You know, and that responsibility may be to say, yeah, I was too busy following, I was too busy doing as I was told, I was too busy complying, and I've realized that that's not a good idea. I should go away and think about things for myself and come to decisions. And when we see the kind of increments of dissonance that lead somebody into a cult or a gang or any dangerous organization, the little steps, the baby steps that lead to these horrifying conclusions. I've spoken before on this channel about Brian Tully, who was a brilliant psychologist, now retired. And he was a forensic psychologist, and he gave a talk that I attended in the 1990s. In fact, I asked them to have him come and talk because I'd heard about him. And he said he dealt with white collar criminals, and he'd interview them. And he said so often there'd be somebody who was a lawyer who'd committed some massive embezzlement or fraud. And he said, well, it started so simply. My boss asked me to backdate a contract by a day. And in the mafia, you get this thing of, well, you just do this little thing for us and everything will be fine. And then it's, well, you did that little thing and we're going to tell on you if you don't do this next thing. And people are drawn in step by step, so that, like the, in fact, urban legend frog that won't jump out of the water. And I've not tested this because I like frogs, but just in case. But I'm told that they will actually jump out of the water. But the metaphor is too good. That once we've, it's called the consistency principle by Bob Cialdini. Wonderful influence. Consistency or commitment. I call it inertia. Spike tells me I should be calling it momentum, but that's a faction of the Labour Party here, so I'm not going to call it that. But it's inertia. You keep moving in the direction you're moving, or not moving in the direction you're not moving. And the group dynamics, the, you know, pleasing the people around us, belonging to the group, showing our commitment, lead us along until one day there we are at Nuremberg going, Befehl ist Befehl. I was just following orders. And seeing just how complicated the network of influences is in any person, and how much we do have to say, yeah, I was led to this conclusion. So, the shorthand with Charles Manson is very easy. Most of his followers believed he was the second coming of Jesus. Are you going to do what God tells you or not?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think that's where it gets really, really helpful to not only take the accountability, but then dive deeper, and really say, so okay, I did this, or I said this, or I chose to remain silent, or I chose not to interfere, so you're taking the accountability of the actual act in the moment. But I think as you reveal the line of thinking that got you to that point, that's where you really start to uncover the more subtle aspects of it, which are the real teaching tool for everyone. Because like you were just referencing, when there's unhealthy power dynamics that you have in a lot of group situations, that plays a whole influence into the whole factor of the peer pressure element, people pleasing element, all those sort of things. But it also happens in the one-on-one cultic relationship too. I'm working on a project now where I'm really trying to dive into using the one-on-one cultic relationship as just an archetype of what happens in any sort of cultic relationship. And obviously, mine was a group dynamic, but this idea of giving away your power and also taking things that are so clearly abusive on the chin, but having a rationalization process that allows you to accept it under the guise that this is part of your training, or it's what you deserve, or all this sort of like horrible things that we allow, because it's always very easy to kind of get outside of that and look at it and say, how could you ever take that, someone saying that to you or someone doing that to you? And this is where the accountability aspect of it, of saying, yes, that did happen, and also let me explain how and why, because and again, it's not easy stuff. You have to really, not only as a part of the recovery process, you not only have to take the accountability for it, but you have to dive into like, okay, well, I want to take ownership of it, but I also need to understand why I did that, and really dive into yourself and kind of say, well, what was I thinking back then, so that you can relay it to someone else.
Yeah.
So it's not easy stuff. And I'm not trying to say this from the point of view of like, oh, this is all you have to do. I'm saying it from the point of view of recognizing that it seems to be that part of the process that is really the most useful work for our healing to take place. Because I do think part of the healing, process is that understanding of what happens so that you can relay it to others. So not only are you potentially passing off information that you wish you had had back, like I wish I had had this information back before. I might not have done some of the choices I did, but it's also this feeling of like just being able to make someone understand you, so you feel more seen and accepted, and don't feel afraid to have to take ownership of this accountability, because it's if it's not explained, if it's just, oh, I did this, then people can draw a judgment that may not be accurate if you don't explain what were the dynamics underneath that allowed you to get to that place. Like you said with the frog, like what were the incremental compromises that got me to the place where I started to think along these lines, and how did it really look, and how did it really feel, and how did I, what kind of reactions and emotional state did I feel, either leading up to the decision, or how I felt after making that choice, and all those sort of things. And I think that's really where the rubber meets the road, and that's where the healing takes place. But it's hard work, but I think it's the work that serves the individual the most.
Yeah, it's an intrinsic part of recovering to
Yeah.
to take account of what you did, and to the best of your ability understand why you did it. Robert J. Lifton, the great Robert J. Lifton,
Yes.
um,
Great.
talks about doctrine over person or ideology over experience, that point where we push aside what we ourselves know, what we ourselves have experienced, instead believing the teaching of the cult. And I think that's the other part of this equation, which is I did these things because I believed these things. Why did I come to believe these things? And firstly, before we go any further, are these things true? And this is a failing I've seen in many people who are trying to help somebody who's been involved in a cult. Just coming to the simple point of saying, what's the truth of these assertions? What's the truth of this doctrine? My late great friend, Professor Jos Urgud, said people who talk, the pro-cult apologists will not ask the truth question. Are these teachings true? Now, Jos was a Christian minister. He was a professor of theology, and a remarkable, brilliant man who did a great deal of good in the world and was thusly attacked. And you'll find all sorts of scandals attached to his name. I doubt that any of them are true from my experience with him. But the truth question. So is there something in the doctrine of the group that you now look at and go, actually, that's not true? Because that will start, because the problem is, and I don't like the term programming, I don't like the idea of deprogramming. We are not computers. We do not function on a binary system. We are way more complicated than that.
Right. Yeah.
But nonetheless, it is as if the doctrine becomes a program. The doctrine, and what I see frequently is unhealed former members who then viciously attack current members rather than seeking to help them. And as if by my friend Carlos Cornier, when many years ago, when he was on the rehabilitation project force in Clearwater, Florida, in Scientology, he's being treated as scum. You're not allowed to talk. You have to run between your assignments. You don't get a bed to sleep on. You eat table scraps. It's pretty hefty. And something I didn't know about really when I was involved. That's how was such a well kept secret. But he's there at the lowest ebb, and there's a protest against Scientology, placards and everything, and one of the protesters spits at him. And to me, that puts everything into focus, that you have to understand that the poison is the poison. The person giving you the poison thinks it's medicine. They think it's helpful to you. The poison is the doctrine. And wherever the doctrine becomes anti-human, wherever it treats others, treats us as superior and others as inferior, wherever it takes away consensus, agreement, discussion, debate, these elements, when they exist within a doctrine, are wrong. I mean, I'm going to get myself into a lot of trouble now, yet again, because to understand Charles Manson, there he is again. You have to get that for the first 20 years of his life, he was immersed in Christian doctrine. So his grandma, Nancy Maddox, who was the only person who was kind to him when he was a child. And he wasn't a very nice child, but she was the only person that was kind to him. His mum wasn't. His aunt and uncle he stayed with weren't. And certainly the institutions he spent most of his time in between the age of 12 and 20 were not kind to him. So his grandma read the Bible to him, and she was a literalist Christian, even though she actually belonged to a Wesleyan Methodist sect. We're in the Bible Belt, where things get a little bit hairy at times. So she was a really kindly woman who believed that the end days were coming, and here we were, and we got to deal with it. And the book of Revelation, when we talk about doctrine and the dangers of doctrine, then there is this little book that got tacked onto the end of the Bible almost by accident. It was one of two so-called apocalyptics or revelations about the end days. And when the Bible was formulated around about 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea, under the direction of the Emperor Constantine, who actually told them to get on with it and pushed the whole process through. And it gave us the Nicene Creed. I believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth. I think there are 27 points, which are agreed upon by the Orthodox, the Catholic, and the Protestant churches. There are a few churches, the Thomist, the Syrian, the Aramaic churches, and the Copts, that precede Nicaea, and so don't have the Nicene Creed, and they contain probably less than 100,000 people. They're tiny compared to the Christian confession. So you've got this thing that is made and forced upon them, and the canon, the books that are acceptable and not acceptable, is decided by those people at that time. Would we now accept the revelation of St. John? Should we now accept the revelation of St. John the Divine? Because I've just read it. I can't make head nor tail of it. There's a 7-headed monster with 10 crowns. I mean, how does that work out? How do you get 10 crowns on 7 heads? I mean, that's beyond me. Jesus will come and rule for 1,000 years while Satan is locked up, and then Satan will be let out again to do things. Well, why? Why are we letting him out again? So the moderate Christian view, this is John of Patmos complaining about the Diocletian persecution, the emperor, imperial persecution of Christians and indeed of Jews, let's be fair. And that's what it is. So the 7 heads of the 7 hills of Rome and this, that, and the other. And you go, if we allow the old notion of Pesha in rabbinical scholarship or hermeneutics in Christian scholarship, where texts must be interpreted. When Jesus says, if your right hand offend thee, cut it off. If thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out. Well, I've met a lot of Christians, but not many of them had one hand and one eye. And I'm guessing that along the way, their eyes and hands have at some point offended them. So none of us believe that that's a literal instruction. And yet, people will then seek to understand this doctrine that has really led to some rather difficult situations, like the Crusades, for example. Revelation plays a big part in that. The uprisings during the Commonwealth in the 1640s in England, a lot of sects came out of the Revelation. End days Christians, well, World War One, called Armageddon, the term used in Revelation, right onto the Iraq War, where there are end days Christians, or indeed the creation of Israel. That was because of Zionism is not a Jewish thing. Zionism started in the 1620s among English Puritans, because Revelation has this idea the Jews all have to go back to Zion, which is Jerusalem, convert to Christianity, and then Jesus will come back. So we then find the British Army dispatching Orde Wingate, who would later become famous for running the Chindits in Burma during World War II. Orde Wingate is dispatched to teach Haganah and Irgun, the Jewish terrorist organizations, how most effectively to harm Arab communities. This is the British Army doing this. And then you go, and Orde Wingate was a member of, I can't remember whether he was Plymouth or exclusive, but he was a member of the Brethren, who believe that the Jews have to go back to Zion and convert to Christianity. So this doctrine has caused amazing effects, with everybody going, this is the generation, he's coming back now. He's coming back now. 2,000 years. And he ain't shown yet. We kept the seat warm and the table set, as 10cc had it in the second sitting for the Last Supper. That every generation is saying, these are the end days. And
it's the end time. No, exactly.
And so a doctrine can be that powerful. And I think you have to come away from it. And those of my Christian friends, good Christian friends, who look at this and say, well, it's something to be interpreted. It's something, it's not a literal statement in any way. And they've made something relatively safe of it. Somebody like Charles Manson who's saying, it's helter-skelter, it's right now. We've got to start the race war, which will kill. Yeah, there's even a thing in the Manson story that the X's on their foreheads, people mystified about the X's on their foreheads, and you're going, it's Revelation. It's the mark of the beast.
Oh, yeah.
It's right there on the forehead, as it says in the book.
I think, I mean, you, as always, you raise so many great points, but the one thing that really resonated with me was this idea of how we interpret things and the indoctrination thing. And like you're talking about the Bible, and I've always looked at the Bible as something, and I have not studied the Bible. My sister's a Bible scholar, and I can only look at it in more of an interpretive, metaphorical way. Like, this idea of indoctrinating and the way that, that this is the word of God and all those things, that just, I think, is real thin ice to be walking on. And it's very counterproductive to telling people this and getting
The received word of God.
Yes, exactly. Because and being a writer and knowing how it's always your intention to embellish and make the story better, to start saying, oh, this is clearly the word of God. It's like, how many humans' hands has this been in? Like, you got to be kidding me, So I really just look at it from that point of view.
And Jesus says, "Not that I believe the words of men."
Yeah.
And whichever way round you get it,
yeah,
and they
exactly.
wrote this down. God, the only thing attributed to God in terms of a written text is the Ten Commandments. That's your lot.
And just as we both know, words in general can be interpreted so many different ways, right? So this is what I think is so challenging about using kind of scripture, or even in like a situation like mine, which was, obviously we looked into more of the Hindu Vedas, which there's some great scriptures in those things as well. But ultimately, when I really think of the crux of the matter is, and when I'm talking to some of the ex-members that still feel kind of stuck and still indoctrinated, for lack of a better, they're still kind of caught. There's words as simple as love that they have held on to, the idea that the cult leader loved them, and they've never felt love like this, that they felt, in the group, so to speak. And
his followers said this of Charles Manson.
Yeah, so yeah, that word love can be so triggering to all of us, because I think it all means something different to each one of us. Like, this is the thing. This is where I'm saying, like that we know what that word, we want it to mean to us, and that's what we're hearing when we hear that word spoken. And when the cult leader's saying, "Oh, I love you," or one of the other members like, "Oh, I just love you," you keep having this reinforcement from your perspective of what you're hearing and what it means to you, right? But then you have to kind of say, and this is kind of what you were referring to earlier, does what that feeling is and what you want that word to mean, does it measure up to what happened? Like if I believe someone loves me, it should be demonstrated in their actions how that plays out, that I interpret the actions to say, oh, that is my understanding of love and I'm feeling loved. But if someone's just saying it, that word, but then doing things that in my mind is not what a loving person would do to me, that's where you have to start going, well, wait a second, what really happened here then? Just because they said they love me, but then they did these things, that is not what I would say, or certainly hold in my own perspective of what a person who loves another would do to that person. That's where you have to really start to break it apart and kind of say, maybe they didn't love me, or certainly what their understanding of love is very different than mine. And so I need to look at it through that perspective, not just get caught up in the word because it was said to me. Does that make sense to you?
It absolutely makes sense. If we look at Om Shinrikyo, Osahara taught his followers that as an act of love, they needed to bring the karma of the Japanese people to an end. Or to be more precise, and you've studied the Vedas, the karma vipaka, the action and reaction. And they point to a tenet in Buddhism called poa, whereby what you're doing is you're accelerating karmic retribution, so the person will become free of the burden of their karma. And their act of love was to kill the whole population of Japan. Now, if we take it to its illogical conclusion, then you'd really want to make sure that all of their bad karma was excised. So you would torture them slowly to death out of love. So we can see this complete redefinition of, and they might have called it tough love, very tough indeed, you know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they had enough sarin gas to kill 4 million people. That's
Wow.
what they'd accumulated by the time they were caught. And it's only because of one incredibly brave railway conductor
Wow.
who saw the device, and he died. He was one of the dozen people who died because he alerted people to it. They could very easily have been thousands of casualties that day.
Oh my goodness.
And but that's how love becomes twisted when you read Himmler's orders to the SS in the death camps. That he's saying, you know, what you're doing is for the good of humanity, and you must not lose your own humanity by doing this. So in the evening, after you've murdered however many people,
Yeah.
drink German beer, sing German songs, and, you know, remember what it is that you're doing. So reframing something, you know, it's like this idea that when hypnotized, you'll never do anything that violates your own conscience. Take this
Yeah.
toy gun and pull the trigger. Okay.
Yeah.
Conscience isn't necessarily involved in these things, and conscience itself can be twisted so that we get this kind of, sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind. I'm only doing this for your own good. This hurts me a lot more than it hurts you. These strange mentalities, spare the
Yeah.
rod and spoil the child, that justify barbaric behavior
Yeah.
in terms of it being for the good, for loving reasons. And I hope that that transformation is gradually happening in the world, where
I hope
people are
so.
understanding that battering children doesn't do them good, and that Nietzsche's ridiculous idea that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger is a ridiculous idea.
Yeah.
That, you know,
Yeah.
hitting your children with a baseball bat doesn't actually make them stronger. You know, that's just, and he was a philosopher, he should have known better. But
I mean, the title of this new piece I'm doing about the cultic relationship is "Look What You Made Me Do," right? You know, which is just the textbook message from the abuser, right? It's, you know, I'm the victim. You've done all these awful things to me, and this is why I've had to abuse you.
yeah,
Look what you made me do.
yeah,
Yeah, and you know, it really, you know, it really comes down to um, this feeling of like people want to be able to make sense of why they do things, but you know, there's so many kind of it's so easy to give away your power, and you know, it's this. I watched this film. I think it was called the Art of Killing. It was a documentary about what happened in Indonesia. Did you watch
yeah.
this
And
one? Yeah,
we've talked about this
yeah,
in East Timor,
yes, right.
the massacres, and where they
How
were
they
sitting around smoking cigarettes and talking about the happy days they'd had
happy
murdering
days when they
people.
were executors. Yeah, yeah, where they, and I think it was like 20 million people they executed over that time
I
period
don't think
of,
it comes quite up to that number, but it is a
yeah,
huge number
a
of people.
huge number. It happened in the 60s. We don't even know about it. And so yeah, so that's a great demonstration of people being able to compartmentalize, right? You know, of, and it's like, oh, like you were just saying earlier, but then I was just doing my job, right? And that's where the accountability is like, you can't, you know, let yourself off on that, because you're not going to heal on any level if you don't take responsibility for what you actually did. And so I've talked to people where I've said I had this kind of desire to, in telling my story, often make the people who I think were the most abusive accountable, because I just want to tell the story to say this is how they behave, because they're not taking the accountability at this stage. And it's not that I have this desire to throw them under the bus. I'm just trying to, you know, to the best of my ability, tell the story what happened, and that this is what people did, and this is how I felt. This is now how they felt. I don't know, because they've left themselves out of that process. And you know, I've had people say to me like, "Well, are you hoping to get an apology from them?" And well, that's not really what's driving this at all. But I said, I would like to get an apology because it would demonstrate that they're on the recovery path.
Mm.
That part would be great, because I said the only reason you say a genuine apology to someone is because you start taking accountability, right? I mean, it's like any addict who finally admits that an alcoholic, or they've been, addicted to whatever drug it may be, when they start
First
taking
step.
accountability, then becomes the step of making amends. You want to go back to all the people that you kind of committed, some level of abuses to, or things that you just want to apologize for. That, so for me, it's not that I need to hear the apology from someone. I just would love to hear it because it would demonstrate they're on the path of recovery, which I would be emphatically supportive of. And I think that's what's an interesting thing to kind of look at these things is the accountability allows us to kind of reintegrate our lives again.
Yes.
And to kind of put things at balance, because no one, if they take real responsibility for things like I was saying earlier, when I said harmful things to my family or harmful things to my friends, my intention was to hurt. I own that. I really, that I can rationalize all the reasons how I got there at that time, thinking I was doing them, a good thing. It's the same thing for me recruiting someone in. I thought I was doing them a solid at the time.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean I don't want to go back to that person and say, I am sorry that I did that. I really did think at the time I was helping out, but I realized it's not what it was. And I feel awful about that. Like, that's important for me to say those things to those people. And I think it's something that you just can't cast off just with a statement saying, oh, well, yeah, I did that when I was, under the influence, or I was, brainwashed, or I was programmed, all those words that we all know. It's just so much more layered than that. And I think, it's such an important part of that healing process, is to be able to not only take the accountability, but to dig in deeper and really kind of let those machinations that kind of created the environment to allow us to even get to that place. Those many compromises that the frog makes as you're incrementally turning up the heat. That's where the empathy and I think it's also where the thing that I talked about earlier, right? We started the compulsion to talk about it comes through, because you have to kind of talk about it. That's how we process trauma. That's how we process anything rough we've gone through, and there's a need to communicate, and it has to start with the accountability, I think.
And we have a tremendous resistance to it because we have to live with the sense that we're right. If I disbelieve my perception and interpretation of the world, what's left for me? And so this creates a kind of invisible field where we will justify our actions. We will, whatever it takes to make us right in the situation. That's the default setting for a human being who is not damaged. Somebody who's an egoist will take another position, but for most of us, we think we're right. And so, my friend Jesse Prince, when I read a blog he'd written before we met, in fact, and he said that it had taken 6 years to lift the cover of my book, Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky. 6 years. He was so phobic about the content. And then he read it, and then he read it again, and then he read it again. And he said, and everybody who's been involved in Scientology should read it 3 times. And Jesse was the head of all of Scientology's counseling technology. He was appointed by Hubbard to run everything. The last person to be appointed by Hubbard to that job. And so he was coming away from that, but getting past whatever the obstacle is, and getting a copy of, Steve Hassan's Combating Cult Mind Control, or his Freedom of Mind, or Lelich and Tobias, Take Back Your Life, or indeed my own Opening Our Minds, and if you've been in Scientology, Blue Sky as well. But having that willingness to suspend your righteousness at the beginning of the journey and say, there are probably things about this that I don't know. Maybe there's more information. And by getting that information, looking at, in Opening Our Minds, as you know, I go through Robert J. Lifton's 8 Deadly Sins of Thought Reform. And I think they're a very good model to look at. I go through it twice. My friend Alexandra Stain said, why do you do it a second time? And it's like, well, read carefully. The first time is when it's imposed from the outside and these things are done to you. And the second time is the way that we do it to ourselves. So, for example, the demand for purity that Lifton talks about, that's not we have our own internal conscience, which will say, well, I'm not following the rules, I'm not doing the right things. And when somebody else starts setting the rules, did you genuflect when you went into the church? Did you light
Right.
a votive candle? Did you follow the procedure properly?
Yeah.
And so the demand for purity, it be something you can find in accounting or mathematics. Demand for purity, get it right, do it right. And it can be heightened to the point where, as happened with you left your group because you decided you were impure. You decided that you could not, you weren't good enough. You couldn't achieve the standards of purity that the group was setting. And I'm very grateful that that happened, because I think it was a good thing for the world that happened, that you left this group and have done
Right.
so much good work since. We're currently mourning the passing of Alan Scheflin a couple of
Mhm.
weeks ago, and a dear man, with whom I did not entirely agree, which is one of the great things in a good friendship,
Yeah.
that we had some differences of opinion over recovered and false memory. But he was a sweetheart. He was a really wonderful man. And he put together what he called the social influence model. And Alan was a law professor who was also had a master's degree in counseling. He was an expert witness in many cases. And he worked long and hard to deal with authoritarian cult groups. And he came up with what he called the social influence model, which he felt judges and jurors in any case where there is some question of the amount of responsibility, to what degree is
Yeah.
the person responsible? And he wasn't
Right.
saying, so let them walk. He wasn't saying, it's not like a temporary insanity plea.
Yeah.
What he's saying is, how accountable are they? And of course, to some extent, can they be reformed? Can the
Right. Yeah. Of
I
course.
was
Right.
only last week going, oh yeah, prisons in America are called correctional institutes. There's an interesting idea. Where does and I found out that in the late 19th century, this notion of correction, of reform, of rehabilitation rose up in a part of the American penal system. And it's, we're all lost. There are too many people in the prisons for us to be able to do very much to help anybody, because we've got laws that are,
Right.
possibly not the right thing or the best thing to do
Yeah.
with people. That they've found, there are, now that Joe Biden's admitted that cannabis isn't as bad as LSD. I'm not really sure what his problem with LSD was. Did he have a bad trip or something? But it's
Right.
not as bad as heroin and LSD. And I'm kind of going, all right. But so therefore, federal prisoners, people who've been arrested for possession of cannabis or marijuana, as it's mistakenly known in the United States, mistranslation of a Mexican word, meaning anything you can smoke, that with the change of attitudes, we're now saying, well, no, it wasn't wrong to use cannabis. And we've now got this thing of medicinal cannabis, 38 states now permit it in the US.
Yeah.
Whereas in my benighted country, it took a real effort to shift it from Schedule 1, which is drugs with no medicinal value, to Schedule 2. The fact that there are now hundreds of scientific papers on this subject, but a belief comes into a society, a doctrine comes into a society and says, well, this is the way it is, so that when our then Home Secretary Jackie Smith approached the head of the body that was looking after drug research for the government, David Nutt, and said to him, you can't compare cannabis to alcohol. And he said, why? He said, because cannabis is illegal. You go, okay. Not much critical thinking going on at the high levels
Yeah.
of government at that point. But so we come to, my point is really that in society, we change our values. There are things which are considered, in a puritanical
Yeah.
society, or in a, a more permissive society, there are things that are considered right and wrong. And we have to look inside ourselves, and rather than simply accepting those social patterns, that reefer madness and Harry
Right,
J.
right.
Anslinger and all his great work in the 30s, to demonize cannabis, we have to be able to separate things off and think for ourselves about them. And unlike the governments of the world, we have to be able to look at scientific evidence. We have to be able to, and so in looking back at the groups that we belonged to, how happy were people? How well did they relate to each other? That love and friendship that they talked about, the moment that you raised a question about the leader, you weren't loved anymore.
That's
This
right.
was, this was definitely a kind of love that was
Yeah,
attached to belonging to the group, rather than a genuine love for humanity, which is professed by many groups but not practiced by most of them.
that's correct. Yeah, I mean, I think it really does come down, and we've talked about this before, and you really taught me this, which I'm so grateful for, is the danger of dealing in these absolutes, right?
Mm,
And and these ideals and things like that, and how binary that is.
mm,
And you know, and it's it involves spiritual pride, and it's a lot of ego stuff, right? That's that like you said, the righteous, that need to be right, and I certainly know. I've had some ayahuasca experiences where I've been in that heightened state, and I'm like, um, being right compared, according to who and what? Like what are you talking about? And I think it's a challenging situation because yes, there are, you need social guidelines for us to have societies, and there are kind of dictates that come down, like they say this is right or wrong, and but that doesn't mean you can't question it more deeply for yourself, right? You have to know, okay, well, these are the mores of the society, so to speak, that I'm existing in. So I need to be um, uh, aware of them, and operate with that awareness of knowing that there's certain things I need to maybe limit my behavior, what I can say or do, and all of that. But that doesn't stop me trying to develop my own moral compass based on my own introspection and reflection and all these sort of things, and what do these words or instances or behaviors really mean to me, and how do I kind of put that through my own personal filter and make sense of it. And I think, yeah, it's I think the biggest catch and temptation with most of these groups is they're always selling a shortcut. Like the process I'm describing is really complicated, and it's really layered, and it
mm,
takes a lifetime to keep reevaluating, because I think that idea that we arrive to a place where you say, okay, well, this is just the way that is. I can check the box and say, well, that's a truth. And that's a dangerous thing to do, because I think you can lean into something and say, oh, my life has demonstrated to me that this seems to be truthful. And again, we're getting into semantics here, but I mean, you can start to say that over your life, you've accumulated a perspective of saying, in this category, this seems to be the way things are. But getting to the idea where you put a rubber stamp on and say, well, that's just the way it is, puts you in the place where you can be manipulated by
mm,
that idea. If you stay in the place of continuing to take in information, because maybe there's a greater nuance to this thing that you think is truthful, or you might just be wrong, like something might come in and just go, oh, actually, that's not it at all.
mm.
But you have to stay in that place of malleability, I think, of where you're still taking information, you're still reanalyzing. Yeah, it's a lifetime challenge, and it's hard to do. These groups offer, oh no, got all that figured out. Here's all the
Certainty.
rules, follow this, all this thing. Yeah, the certainty stuff. And I think that's where we get into trouble. And that's where thinking along those lines, that's, bringing it back, that's why it's so hard to take the accountability
Mm,
on these things, because it is even more complicated than just saying, oh, yes, I did this, or I didn't do this, or I should have done, all those sort of things. It's a complicated process, but I encourage, others to go down that journey, because that's where the real healing takes place, in my opinion. That's just my opinion, but that's what I found has served me the most, is is doing my best to try to take responsibility for those actions or inactions, and really kind of reflect on what has it taught me, not only about myself but the world I live in, and continue to keep that going. And yeah, I think I'm glad we got to talk about it.
Yeah, me too. And it
Yeah,
is the process of becoming an individual,
yeah,
of um, developing your own conscience and your own view. I mean, again, cannabis becomes relevant in that I read this thing last week. I'm reading a book about it at the moment, which is why it's on my mind, saying that our Home Office believes that 1.4 million people in this country, population about 64 million, 1.4 million people use cannabis for a medical reason. Now, over the beyond that, how many millions are using it recreationally, and whether
right.
recreational use is actually antidepressant use, or
Mhm.
that's another question altogether. But I'm kind of going, so those people are all criminals. You've created a society where there are people, and again with the Manson case, if
Right,
drugs had not been criminalized in the way they were, then maybe members of the 35 people that came and went through the Manson family would have gone to the police. They
right,
didn't go to the police because they had been alienated by the society. They were partaking of something. And now we come to this ridiculous idea 1.4 million people are using this drug medicinally. Oh dear. So the medicinal benefits of this drug, which seem to be quite remarkable for some people, according to
right.
hundreds of thousands now of anecdotal reports or real world evidence, RWE as it's now being called by some scientists. The real world evidence is that this is a substance that for some people is tremendously useful and can replace other substances, the opioids, which I saw something yesterday, more than 100,000 people died of opioid use last year in the United States.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't know if you've seen that TV program Dope Sick is all about the Oxycontin, which is the
Mm.
opioid, or there's a new one called Painkillers, which is the same sort of thing. And,
Yeah.
you know,
So we have these incredibly dangerous drugs which are on prescription, which make a fortune for pharmaceutical companies and which are incredibly dangerous. And that some of them, say the painkilling effects, um, there are people who will respond well to cannabis. They won't need, say,
right,
gabapentin or the other chemicals that have been using, which are all hard drugs, that is addictive, unlike cannabis, and which have sometimes quite horrible side effects. And so we get into this place where, oh, this is the demand for purity. This is that politicians have arrived at a point where they want us to be pure, just as the Temperance League wanted people to be
yeah,
pure.
right, 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 right,
And, the rather than saying, what right do we have to our own bodies? If I have the right to commit suicide, and I think our law changed in the 1950s so that we were allowed the right to kill ourselves. I have the right to kill myself. I have the right to damage myself. I have the right, therefore, to take substances according to my desires. I absolutely understand that arsenic, strychnine, warfarin should be controlled. Actually, you can buy warfarin in this country as a rat poison if you're looking for something. It's also used as a blood thinner, which is what it does to the poor rats, I'm afraid. But I understand that you restrict poisons in that way. And I personally believe that all addictive drugs should be regulated. I don't know what we do about coffee, but
right.
you know,
Yeah,
I'm
right.
afraid it is an addictive drug.
Yeah,
But
true.
certainly alcohol's purity, we saw, during Prohibition, the amount of deaths from alcohol went up, I think, 10 times over what they'd been in 1919 when the Volstead Act came in, because people were drinking bathtub gin and this stuff. So you have to just accept some things and regulate them as best you can, make it
Right,
illegal to drive when you've been drinking and stuff like that. But seeing these things, seeing the whole world through Lifton's wonderful spectacles and saying, yeah, our behavior is cultic. And for all of us, whether we've been involved in a group recognized as a cult or not, to become individual, to become adult, to grow up, is to develop a conscience and say, I had a conversation with a policeman about this a few years ago. And he said, well, I've Do I get called out on a Sunday morning because somebody who's been smoking cannabis has broken all of the windscreens in a car park? No. Do I get called on out on a Sunday morning because somebody's got drunk and done it? Yep, happened a few times. However, it's illegal. And so I said, yeah, here's a point. If your mum had a disease, say one of the forms of epilepsy, that is only treatable with cannabis, you're a copper. Would you get her the medicine that helped her, or would you hold to the law? And by the way, at Nuremberg, it was determined that a law that is harmful to people should not be followed by the police. So that's international law. Here we are. Yeah. But it's a matter of developing your own relationship and understanding what the dangers and the benefits of a situation are, and being able to assess your own behavior and lead to this place that we've both talked about so often, which is humility.
Yeah.
Being able to say, maybe that wasn't such a clever thing that I did.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
And forgiveness and, an apology and all of that. Well,
absolutely.
How does the time go so quickly? That's what I want.
I don't know, but I always enjoy it, and it's a real gift. So I look forward to our next time, because I always learn a lot, and it's just great, sharing some time with you, John.
It's always stimulating, and I too always learn a great deal from our conversations. So thank you very much, and there will be links in the description below. Let me remind Spike that the social influence model is on our new website, which nobody knows about, which is johnatack.co.uk.
Oh, I didn't know that either. Yeah.
No, well, I don't think we've released it yet. I don't know why, but it is there, and it's
.co.uk. Okay.
Yeah, and there's an ancient website which is a .com, which was abandoned in 2005, which has a lot of my strange thoughts about all sorts of things on it for anybody who's so inclined. But this is to say the social influence model, which I mentioned by Alan Scheflin, which I think is remarkable. And Alan left only one version of it that he'd approved of. And that's the version that's in my book, and it's the version that's on the website there. And I think it's a really fascinating way of looking at culpability. And I think, did they do it? Didn't they do it? It's not quite enough. We do need to understand how somebody was influenced to do things. So thank you very much, Hoyt. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure, John. Great to see you as always.
Yeah, and we'll talk again in the soonness of time.
That's right. Exactly. Great.
Grand. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.